What if the person you'd trust with your last breath was the one holding the knife? What if the gathering that was supposed to be about love, about food and laughter and the particular warmth of people who share your blood, was actually the last step of a plan built in secret, over months, by someone who had been smiling at you the whole time? I need you to sit with that for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story you'll see coming, even though every single sign was right there. And I, a woman who thought she knew her family better than she knew herself, missed all of them. The truth has a way of arriving like that, not as a slow revelation, but as a collision, sudden and complete, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon on a Georgia back road, when all you were trying to do was get to a family reunion in time for lunch. I've been cheated in ways I didn't have a word for until everything collapsed. Not in the way you're maybe thinking, but in a deeper, more disorienting way. Lied to by someone I had fed, loved, defended, and believed in across 6 decades of my life. And the most shocking thing isn't that it happened. It's that I almost didn't catch it in time. 48 hours earlier, if you had asked me whether my son was capable of what I'm about to describe, I would have looked you dead in the eyes and said no. I would have said it with complete conviction, complete certainty, the kind that comes from a lifetime of belief. I couldn't believe it. That's not a figure of speech. It is the most literal description of where I was when it started to unfold. Your mind simply will not accept certain truths about the people you love. And that refusal, that protective, well-intentioned refusal, is exactly what people who want to exploit you are counting on. There are secrets in every family, hidden debts, quiet shames, things spoken about in low voices at the edges of gatherings while the children run in the yard. I had always known that, had always accepted it as the texture of human life, the cost of intimacy. What I had not known, what I had never once imagined, was that the secret being kept in my family was about me, that I was the subject of the silence, the target of the plan, the one being deceived while I passed the bread and poured the sweet tea and believed, completely, in the story I was living. The infidelity of that isn't romantic. It's more fundamental. It's a betrayal of the most basic contract between people who call themselves family. I see you clearly, and I will not use what I see against you. That contract had been violated, carefully, over 2 years, by someone I had watched learn to walk. What happened next, once I finally understood what was being built against us, changed not just my circumstances, but the entire architecture of how I understand trust, how I understand love, and how I understand what justice actually looks like when the person who harmed you is someone you will never stop, in some complicated corner of your heart, loving. This isn't a story about revenge in the way you might expect. It isn't loud, and it isn't cinematic, and there's no single moment where everything is made right. What it is, what it absolutely is a story about what happens when a woman decides, finally and completely, that the truth of her life matters more than the comfort of the lie, and what that decision costs. And what, against all reasonable expectation, it eventually gives back. Turn the car around, Mark. Right now. The moment I told Mark to turn that car around, my hands were already shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that had been quietly building in my chest for miles. We were heading to what was supposed to be a simple family gathering, the kind you look forward to all year, with food on the table and laughter echoing through the house. But that morning felt different. The sky looked the same, the road looked the same, yet nothing felt right. I couldn't explain it with logic, not yet, but my body already knew what my mind was refusing to accept. Something was terribly wrong, and every mile we drove felt like walking closer to a fire I couldn't yet see. I caught a glimpse of my son Nathan's car parked just ahead, near the entrance of the old farmhouse his cousin owned outside of Savannah, Georgia, and the look on his face stopped my breath cold. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't waving, He was watching us with that blank, calculating expression I had only seen once before, years ago, when he thought no one was looking. I told myself I was being paranoid. What kind of mother suspects her own child of something sinister at a family reunion? But betrayal doesn't announce itself with a warning label, and I had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. The word family had always felt like a shield to me, something sacred, something unbreakable. But shields can be used as weapons too, and I was just beginning to understand that. There were 2 trucks parked off to the side of the dirt road, big, dark, unfamiliar, and the men standing beside them weren't relatives, weren't neighbors, weren't anyone I recognized from years of holiday dinners and birthday cakes. They were watching our car with a stillness that made my stomach drop, the kind of stillness that isn't peaceful, it's predatory. I grabbed my husband's arm and whispered, "Don't stop. Don't slow down. Just keep driving." My voice came out steadier than I felt, but inside, I was screaming. At the time, I thought I might be overreacting. I didn't know yet how deep it actually went. I couldn't believe what my instincts were telling me, that this reunion, this gathering of blood and memory, had been designed as something else entirely. Mark glanced at me, confused, maybe even a little annoyed, because to him it still looked like a normal afternoon in the Georgia countryside. But 38 years of marriage means your partner eventually learns to trust your silences more than your explanations, and when he saw my face, he didn't ask questions, he just drove. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear the radio, barely hear anything except that primal alarm screaming inside me. Leave, leave, leave. I had spent decades building a family I was proud of, a life rooted in dignity and hard work, and in that single frozen moment on a dusty road outside Savannah, I felt all of it trembling beneath me like ground about to crack. The truth, whatever it was waiting just ahead, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I reached into my purse and pressed my fingers around my phone, not sure yet who I would call, not sure yet what I would say. Because what do you say when the danger you're fleeing has your son's face? What do you say when the trap was built by someone who once called you mom and meant it? Or at least, you believed he meant it. I had loved Nathan fiercely, wholly, the way only a mother can. And that love had made me blind to things I probably should have seen coming months before this moment. The road behind us disappeared in the rearview mirror, and I watched the farmhouse shrink into the distance. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like ice, that distance alone wasn't going to save us. This was only the beginning. And as Mark finally turned the car onto the highway heading back toward town, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. But the relief didn't last, because my phone buzzed. Nathan's name lit up the screen, and the sight of it made something twist violently inside my chest. He was calling. He already knew we had turned around. And that single fact, that he knew, told me everything I had been too afraid to admit to myself for the past 3 months. There are moments in life when the fog lifts all at once, not slowly, not gently, but like a curtain being ripped off a window you didn't even know was covered. That's exactly what happened to me in the passenger seat of our car, somewhere on the I-16 heading back toward Macon, with Nathan's missed call still glowing on my phone screen. The plan had been building for 2 years. I had started noticing the cracks 3 months ago. But even 48 hours before that road, the whispered phone calls he ended whenever I walked into the room, the legal papers he'd casually asked me to just glance at over dinner, the way he'd been steering every family conversation toward our property in Beaufort. I still trusted him. They weren't separate, disconnected fragments anymore. They were a map. And the destination was a trap with our names on it. I couldn't believe I had almost walked right into it. The reunion had never been about family. I understood that now with the kind of cold, bone-deep clarity that only comes when the shock is too big for tears. Nathan had chosen that farmhouse deliberately. Remote, isolated, Far enough from town that help wouldn't arrive quickly, surrounded by people who answered to him and not to us. He had planned to get us alone, away from our lawyer, away from our neighbors, away from anyone who might ask questions or push back. And once he had us there, isolated and off balance, he was going to pressure us, maybe even intimidate us, into signing over the deed to our Beaufort property and handing him financial control over accounts I had built across 40 years of careful, disciplined saving. This wasn't impulsive. This was engineered. This was a betrayal that had been quietly constructed, brick by brick, right under my roof, by my own son. I had suspected something was wrong since November. That's the part that haunts me most, the part that makes me feel like I failed myself. Nathan had started showing up with a kind of desperation he was trying to hide behind charm, asking questions about our estate plans, our retirement accounts, the value of the Beaufort house. I told myself he was just being responsible, just being thorough. Maybe he'd finally grown up and started thinking about the future. That's what I wanted to believe, because the alternative was unbearable. But the truth doesn't care about what you want to believe. And the truth was that my son was in serious financial trouble, the kind that makes people do things they'd never otherwise consider. I had let months pass, kept quiet, kept the peace, and my silence had given him time to build the whole scheme. That guilt sat on my chest like a stone. The men in those trucks weren't random. I knew that now, too. Nathan was involved with people who had lent him money he couldn't repay, and those people weren't the kind who send polite letters. They were the kind who show up at remote farmhouses on Saturday afternoons and stand very still while they wait for the people who owe them to deliver what was promised. Mark and I weren't just targets of our son's greed. We were the collateral he had offered without our knowledge. The sheer scale of the humiliation washed over me in waves. He had used our name, our property, our trust as bargaining chips in a game we didn't even know we were playing. And he had done it while calling me on Sunday mornings to ask how I was feeling and whether my knee was still bothering me. I stared out the window at the Georgia flatlands rushing past, and I thought about every birthday cake I had made for that boy, every fever I had sat through, every sacrifice I had made without a second thought because that's what mothers do. They give, and they give, and they give, because they believe the love they're planting will grow into something worthy. And it had grown into this, into a forged document and a scheme and two men in trucks waiting at the end of a dirt road. The word betrayal doesn't capture it. It's too small, too clean. What Nathan had done was a dismantling of trust, of dignity, of every story I had ever told myself about who my family was. But even as the grief hit me, something else was rising alongside it. Something harder and quieter. The absolute, unshakable decision that I was not going to let him finish what he'd started. And as Mark reached over and squeezed my hand without saying a word, I picked up the phone. Not to call Nathan back, but to call someone else entirely. Because the moment I understood the full shape of what had been built against us, I also understood exactly how it needed to be dismantled. The phone rang twice before Nathan picked up. And I will never forget the sound of his voice in that moment. Warm, easy, almost theatrical in its casualness, like a man who has rehearsed his lines so many times they've started to feel real to him. "Hey, Mom, where are you guys? Everyone's waiting." I said nothing for a second, just held the phone against my ear and listened to the background, and what I heard told me more than his words ever could. It was too quiet for a family gathering. No kids laughing, no music, no clattering dishes. Just a low murmur of voices and the unmistakable sound of tension being held very still. The kind of silence that only exists when people are waiting for something. My stomach tightened. He was lying to my face in real time, with the kind of smooth ease that could only come from someone who had been lying for a long time. "We're not coming, Nathan," I said, and I kept my voice even, controlled. The way you speak when you need the other person to show you exactly who they are. There was a pause, barely 2 seconds, but long enough to speak volumes. His voice shifted. It didn't break. It didn't crack. It just changed. The way a mask changes when the person behind it realizes the performance might not be working anymore. He asked why, said he didn't understand, said Grandma Rose had driven all the way from Savannah and everyone was asking for us. Every sentence was designed to make me feel guilty, feel unreasonable, feel like the problem. And I recognized it because I had watched him use that same technique on his sister when they were teenagers, and he wanted to avoid accountability. Karma has a long memory, and so do mothers. "Nathan," I said quietly, "who are those men in the trucks?" And that was the moment the whole performance collapsed. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of warmth. It was flat, controlled, careful, like he was choosing each word with surgical precision. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. He said I was confused. He said I had been under a lot of stress lately, and maybe the drive was getting to me. I almost laughed, not from humor, but from the sheer audacity of a man trying to gaslight his own mother while she's actively escaping the trap he built for her. The truth was right there between us on that phone call, enormous and undeniable, and he was still trying to talk me out of seeing it. Mark was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white. I could see it in my peripheral vision, the set of his jaw, the rigid line of his shoulders. And I knew he was hearing everything, piecing it together in real time the same way I had. 48 years that man had worked alongside me, and not once had I ever seen him afraid. But I saw something close to it in that car, not for himself, but for us. For what we had built together and what we were now understanding was under direct threat from the person we had least expected. The word cheated kept cycling through my mind, not in the narrow sense, but in every possible sense. Cheated out of a relationship built on honesty, cheated out of the right to trust our own child, cheated out of the kind of family story that ends with grace instead of this. Nathan kept talking, kept layering excuse over explanation over gentle pressure, and I let him, because every word he said confirmed what I already knew. He told me to come back. He told me we were being irrational. He told me that if we didn't come, things would get complicated. And there it was. Not a threat with teeth, not yet, but the outline of one. A warning wrapped in just enough ambiguity to be deniable. I told him I had to go. I ended the call, and the silence that followed inside that car was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Because we both knew, Mark and I, that the boy on the other end of that phone was not the version of our son we had believed in. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already wondering exactly how long that version had been gone. That wasn't even the worst part. We pulled into a gas station just outside of Jeffersonville, one of those wide-open roadside stops with a single building, a few pumps, and nowhere near enough people to feel safe. And that's when I saw them again. The same dark truck from the farmhouse road, sitting across the street with its engine idling, making no attempt to hide. They weren't being subtle because they didn't need to be. Subtlety is for people who want to preserve relationships. These men had no relationship with us to protect. They were there to deliver a message. You haven't escaped yet. My hands, which had finally stopped shaking somewhere around Macon, started up again. I told Mark not to get out of the car, not to make eye contact, not to do anything that looked like we were afraid, even though I was terrified in a way I hadn't been since the night our house flooded during a storm years ago, and I genuinely didn't know if we'd make it to morning. The truck pulled forward slowly, crossing the street, coming to a stop at the edge of the gas station lot like it was the most casual thing in the world. One of the men got out, tall, unhurried, wearing the kind of blank expression that professionals wear when they're doing something they've done before. He didn't come to our window. He just stood there, close enough to make his presence known, far enough to stay technically non-threatening. It was a textbook intimidation move, and the fact that I recognized it as textbook didn't make it any less effective. My heart was hammering. I looked at Mark, and I said very quietly, "Call 911, now." And this time, he didn't hesitate for a single second. While Mark made the call, I kept my eyes on the man and my voice steady, narrating to Mark what I was seeing, making sure the dispatcher could hear every detail. The gas station attendant, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, glanced out her window, and I could see from her expression that she noticed something was off too. I made a decision in that moment. I was not going to sit silently in a car and wait to see what happened next. I was not going to be the woman who goes passive when things get dangerous. I had spent 63 years building a life from dignity, and I was not about to let it be stripped from me on the shoulder of a Georgia highway by men my son had invited into our lives without our knowledge or consent. The shaming of it, the absolute staggering humiliation of being hunted by your own child's creditors, fueled something in me that fear couldn't touch. The police arrived in 11 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. 2 patrol cars, lights on, and the truck's passenger door opened briefly before the driver seemed to think better of it and simply pulled out of the lot and drove away. I watched it go, and I exhaled. But I didn't feel relief, not really. Because the truck leaving didn't mean the danger was over. It meant it had simply moved somewhere else, to wait for another moment. The officers came to our window, and I started talking immediately. Calmly, precisely, with the kind of detail that comes when you've been rehearsing a conversation in your mind for the last 45 minutes without realizing it. I told them about the reunion, the farmhouse, the isolated location, the forged documents Nathan had been trying to get me to sign for months. The young officer's expression changed as I spoke. He stopped writing once and just looked at me, and what I saw in his face wasn't pity. It was the particular, grim kind of recognition that comes when something you suspected turns out to be worse than expected. We filed the report right there at the gas station, Mark sitting beside me, one hand on my knee the entire time, the Georgia sun starting to dip toward the tree line, painting everything in amber. As the officer read back what I had described, I heard it all as if for the first time. The plan, the isolation, the pressure, the strangers, the sun. Said out loud in plain language to a stranger with a badge and a notepad, it stopped being something I could explain away or soften or reframe. It was what it was, a coordinated, calculated attempt to strip us of our property and our freedom, and it had been built by someone I had raised. The payback I was beginning to pursue wasn't born from rage. It was born from something much colder and much more powerful than rage. And the officers, I could tell, were already beginning to pull the same thread I had been pulling in my mind since that farmhouse came into view. The thread led somewhere deeper than any of us were quite ready for. I need to tell you something I hadn't told anyone. Not Mark, not my daughter, not even my closest friend Ruth, who has sat with me through every hard thing in the last 2 decades. For 3 months before that Saturday afternoon on the farmhouse road, I had known something was wrong with Nathan. Not suspected. Known. The signs had been there, quiet but consistent, like a crack in a foundation that you keep painting over, because the alternative is accepting that the whole structure might be unsound. I had seen the credit card statements he didn't realize I'd found on the kitchen counter during Christmas. I had overheard a phone call in March that ended the moment I turned the corner. I had noticed the way his wife Carla had stopped meeting my eyes at family dinners. I put all of it together, and then I did the thing I'm most ashamed of. I chose to stay quiet. I told myself I was protecting the family. The truth is, I was protecting myself from having to accept what it meant. That silence, 3 months of it, had been my contribution to this disaster. I'm not saying Nathan's choices were my fault, because they weren't, and I refuse to carry guilt that belongs to him. But I had watched a fire start and chosen not to reach for water, hoping it would put itself out. Instead, it had grown and grown and grown until it needed strangers in trucks to feed it. The betrayal that had driven him to that farmhouse scheme didn't happen overnight. It had been building in layers, and I could trace every single one of them back through that 3-month stretch I had spent pretending everything was fine. Payback, I was learning, doesn't only come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the parts of yourself you refuse to look at directly. What I uncovered, once I finally stopped protecting the silence, was far worse than I had let myself imagine. Nathan hadn't just made a few bad investments. He had borrowed a significant amount of money, somewhere around $240,000, from sources that were not banks and didn't operate with any legal structure I recognized. He had made deals that tied his debt to physical collateral, and when the investments collapsed and the returns never materialized, he had offered our property as a guarantee without a single conversation, a single disclosure, a single honest word. He had taken the thing my husband and I had built across our entire lives and used it as a chip in a game we didn't know we were in. The vengeance I felt wasn't loud. It was the specific, quiet kind that feels like being absolutely certain about something you can never take back. The investigators told me later that Nathan had been operating in this space, borderline legal, deliberately opaque, for nearly 2 years. And during those 2 years, he had maintained the careful illusion of a son who called on Sundays and showed up for Thanksgiving and hugged me goodbye like someone who meant it. He had lied with extraordinary precision and consistency, and the part of me that had loved him most was the part that had made me most useful to the deception. There was a moment, I can see it clearly now, where he chose pride over truth, and everything after that was just him protecting that choice. The truth, when it finally arrived in full, didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like a collision, the kind that leaves you changed at a cellular level. Mark sat across from me at our kitchen table that evening, after the police and the statements and the long drive home, and he said something I'll never forget. "I think we've been seeing the performance, not the person." And that sentence cracked something open in me, because he was right. And because it meant that the grief I was feeling wasn't just for what Nathan had done, but for who I had been so certain he was. You don't just mourn the relationship in moments like that. You mourn the version of yourself that believed in it so completely. And you have to decide, in the ash of all that mourning, what you're going to build next. I wasn't there yet. Not quite. But for the first time since that farmhouse road, I was beginning to understand the full weight of what we were dealing with, and something in me was getting very, very clear about what needed to happen next. I wish that had been the end. But what we found next was worse. The detective who took our case was a woman named Sandra Reeves, mid-40s, steady, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks and sees more than she lets on. She called me 2 days after we filed the report and asked if I could come in, that there had been some developments. I drove to the Bibb County precinct alone. Mark offered to come, but this was something I needed to face on my feet and on my own terms. And when I sat down across from Detective Reeves and she opened the folder on the table between us, I felt the room tilt slightly, the way rooms do when you're about to receive information your body already knows will change things permanently. She slid a document across the table and asked me if I recognized the signature at the bottom. I did. It was mine. Except I had never signed it. The forgery was good, not perfect, but good enough to survive a casual review. Nathan had taken a legitimate document I had signed 3 years earlier, something routine related to a small property tax matter, and had used it as a template to construct a new one that assigned power of attorney over our Beaufort property to a shell company his associates had set up. The document had been submitted to a private escrow service, not a state agency, specifically chosen to avoid the scrutiny that would come from a government filing. If we had never turned that car around, if we had walked into that farmhouse and spent even an hour under the pressure Nathan had been building, the timeline of the scheme suggested we might have signed something that day that would have transferred legal control of our most valuable asset before we even made it home for dinner. The sheer scale of how close we had come made the room feel very small. Detective Reeves watched me process it without rushing me. She had seen this face before, I think. The face of someone realizing that the danger was even more specific than they knew. The investigation expanded quickly. What Nathan had presented as a personal financial mess turned out to involve at least 4 other parties: his wife, Carla, who had signed 2 of the supporting documents, a man named Gregory Polk, who had acted as the unofficial intermediary between Nathan and the private lenders, and 2 individuals whose names I didn't recognize but whose records, Detective Reeves told me carefully, were not clean. The scheme had a structure to it, roles and timelines and a clear chain of instruction, and Nathan was at the center, but he was not the only one who had made deliberate choices. Carla had known. That landed on me harder than almost anything else, because I had loved Carla, had welcomed her into our family like a second daughter, had defended her in arguments with relatives who didn't warm to her quickly enough. She had sat at my kitchen table and eaten my food and looked me in the eyes and carried the secret of what her husband was planning. The betrayal was not singular. It was layered, and every layer had a face I recognized. What the authorities uncovered next went deeper still. Nathan had used family gatherings, including one at my house the previous Christmas, as opportunities to photograph documents from my filing cabinet while Mark and I were distracted with guests. He didn't break in. He didn't need to. We had opened the door for him, because we trusted him. He had turned our home into a tool without us ever feeling it happen. The humiliation of that realization, that the warmth and laughter of a Christmas morning had been the cover story for a burglary conducted by our own son, was a specific kind of pain I don't have adequate language for. Detective Reeves explained it carefully, professionally, but she held eye contact with me when she said it, and I think she understood that she wasn't just delivering facts. She was delivering the final, definitive proof that what I had been grieving since that farmhouse road was real, and earned, and deserved to be grieved. The charges being drawn up included fraud, forgery, attempted extortion, and conspiracy. And the evidence, Detective Reeves told me, was substantial. The district attorney's office had expressed interest in prosecuting aggressively, not just because of the specific harm to us, but because, she said quietly, this kind of operation often has other victims. I sat with that for a long moment. My son, the one I had nursed and raised and sacrificed for, had potentially done this, or some version of this, to other people too. The karma of that thought was staggering, and sitting in that precinct, in a plastic chair with fluorescent lights overhead and a folder of forged documents between me and a detective who was doing her job with quiet precision, I made a decision I hadn't articulated yet, but had been moving toward since that first phone call in the car. I was not going to protect Nathan from the consequences of this. I was not going to pull any string, call any favor, soften any testimony. I was going to let the truth do exactly what truth does when you finally stop standing in its way. And the truth, it turned out, had more to uncover before it was done. The part nobody prepares you for, the part the movies never show, is what happens to a family after the legal machinery starts moving. It doesn't just separate the guilty from the innocent. It doesn't sort cleanly into heroes and villains. It tears through everything like a current through water, touching every person connected, and some of them are connected in ways you never ask them to be. The week after Nathan's arrest, I sat with my daughter Maya in her kitchen in Augusta. She had driven down within hours of hearing the news, and I watched her try to hold herself together while also trying to figure out which memories from her childhood she was allowed to keep. That's what family betrayal does at its most devastating. It makes you audit your entire history and wonder what was real. Maya and Nathan had not been close as adults, but they had been children together, and the boy who built forts with her in the backyard was the same man who had planned to steal from their parents. She didn't know how to hold both of those truths at once. Neither did I. Nathan's debt, I learned in pieces from Detective Reeves and from the financial records that were now subject to the investigation, had been accumulating for nearly 4 years. It had started with a legitimate business venture, a logistics company he had launched with 2 partners, that had underperformed badly in its second year. Instead of cutting losses, Nathan had doubled down, borrowing from increasingly risky sources to keep the appearance of success going, terrified of admitting failure to a family that had always seen him as capable and ambitious. The family drama at the heart of this was, in part, a story about a man who could not bear to be seen as someone who had failed. And that fear had metastasized into something criminal. I'm not offering that as an excuse. I'm offering it as context, because understanding the shape of a betrayal doesn't mean excusing it. It means seeing it clearly enough to respond with precision instead of just pain. Carla had been aware of the financial troubles for at least 2 years, and she had chosen to stay silent to protect her lifestyle and her husband's reputation. And eventually, she had moved from passive awareness to active participation. Her role in signing the forged documents was not coerced, Detective Reeves told me. She had done it with full knowledge of what the documents were. The infidelity I felt from her was in some ways sharper than what I felt from Nathan, because Carla had never owed me the love of a child. She had chosen to enter our family, chosen the relationship with me, chosen every holiday and every phone call, and had made those choices while holding a secret that could have destroyed us. She had worn my trust like a costume. That's a specific kind of cold that settles into your joints and doesn't leave quickly. What broke my heart most cleanly, the part I still struggled to speak about without my throat tightening, was learning about Marcus and Lily, Nathan and Carla's 2 children, my grandchildren. Marcus was 14, Lily was 9, and while neither of them had any knowledge of the financial scheme or the forged documents, they had been present for things no child should carry. Lily had been at the farmhouse that Saturday afternoon, Detective Reeves confirmed. Nathan had brought her, either as a calculated element of the pressure, who causes a scene in front of their grandchildren, or simply because he hadn't thought through what would happen if things went wrong and she was there to witness it. Either way, that little girl had been positioned, without her knowledge or consent, at the edge of something dangerous. And the grief of that, the fact that my son's choices had put his own daughter in that situation, made the decision I had already made feel even more irreversible. I was not going to protect him. Not from this. The debris field of Nathan's choices extended further than any of us had initially traced. Neighbors who had been asked to act as informal witnesses to documents. A family friend who had been asked to hold certain files for safekeeping without being told what they contained. A cousin who had been recruited to attend the farmhouse reunion and had only learned after Nathan's arrest exactly what the gathering had been designed to accomplish. Each new layer of discovery made the whole thing feel less like a crime of desperation and more like a crime of design. Careful, deliberate, built over time by someone who had studied the people around him and calculated exactly how much each one would give before they'd push back. Nathan had known us. He had used that knowledge, and the vengeance I wanted wasn't dramatic. It was the kind that comes from standing in absolute truth and refusing to flinch. But it was what happened with Marcus, 14 years old, watching his father get arrested from a front porch he hadn't asked to be standing on. That made me understand the real cost of everything that had been set in motion. Marcus came to us on a Tuesday, not because anyone asked him to, but because he showed up at our door at 3:30 in the afternoon with a backpack and a face that looked like it had aged 6 years in a week. He was 14, tall for his age, the kind of quiet boy who processes everything internally and shows almost nothing on the outside, which I realized as I looked at him standing in my doorway, was something he had clearly learned at home. I pulled him inside without a word, sat him down at the kitchen table, and made him a plate of food he barely touched. And then I just sat with him, the way you sit with someone when you know that talking isn't what they need yet. The silence between us was the kind that children carry when they've overheard things they don't have the vocabulary for yet, and are waiting for an adult to tell them what it all means. He had known more than anyone had assumed. Not about the documents or the legal scheme. Those details had been carefully kept from him. But about the atmosphere of the last 2 years, the tension in the house, the arguments behind closed doors, The phone calls his father took outside with his back turned. He had noticed when the car they drove changed, when the vacations stopped, when the laughter at home became a performance of laughter instead of the real thing. Children know. They always know. They just don't have the framework to name what they're sensing, so they carry it as a generalized unease. And Marcus had been carrying it for 2 years, alone, in the way children carry things when the adults around them are too consumed with their own fractures to notice what's happening in the smaller, quieter ones. The shocking thing wasn't that Marcus had been exposed to all of this. It was that no one had been paying attention to what that exposure was costing him. He asked me, very quietly, while staring at the untouched food on his plate, whether his father was going to prison. I didn't lie to him. I couldn't. And even if I could have, I wouldn't have. I told him that decisions would be made by people whose job it was to look at everything that happened and decide what was fair. I told him that none of what had happened was his fault, that he had not made any of his father's choices, and that the people who loved him were not going anywhere regardless of what the courts decided. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they hear something they needed, but weren't sure they believed. Then he asked me something that absolutely cracked me open. "Did you know Dad was in trouble?" And I had to sit with that for a second before I answered, because it deserved an honest answer and not a comfortable one. I told him yes. I told him I had seen signs and chosen to stay quiet, hoping things would resolve themselves, and that it was one of the biggest regrets of my life. I told him that adults sometimes make the mistake of protecting a silence when they should be speaking into it, and that sometimes that silence doesn't protect anyone. It just gives problems more room to grow. His expression when I said that was something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Not anger, not relief, just a kind of recognition. The recognition of a child who has been waiting for someone to tell him the truth and is not sure what to do with it now that it's arrived. His self-worth had taken a beating across those 2 years, absorbing an atmosphere of deception and pretending everything was fine, and I could see it in the way he held himself. Slightly braced, slightly diminished, like someone who has learned to take up less space. The most profound act of protection I could offer Marcus, and Lily, who was too young to be having this conversation yet, but would have her own version of it someday, was not to shield them from the reality of what their father had done, but to make sure that reality was handled with honesty and dignity so they could build something true in its place. Dignity isn't given to you by the circumstances. It's something you construct yourself, out of the honest materials available, even when those materials are painful. I told Marcus that. I'm not sure how much of it landed in the way I intended, because he was 14 and in the middle of a kind of grief that age has no good tools for. But he stayed for dinner. He stayed the night. And in the morning, when I found him in the kitchen making toast, like he'd done it 100 times, like it was something ordinary, I thought, this is what we're fighting for. Not the property in Beaufort, not the accounts. This, a boy making toast in his grandmother's kitchen, in a space where the truth is allowed to exist and no one has to pretend. And what was coming next, the confrontation none of us had been able to avoid, was going to require every ounce of that same truth. Nathan had not gone quietly. That was the one thing about my son that hadn't changed. He had never been someone who accepted the closing of a door without trying once more to walk through it. He had been released on bail pending trial, and the conditions were specific. No contact with us, restricted travel, surrendered passport. For 2 weeks, silence. And then, on a Thursday evening in early June, Detective Reeves called to tell me that Nathan had been found at a storage unit registered under Gregory Polk's name in Warner Robins, and that when they searched it, they found a second set of documents. Not copies of the forged ones. Something else entirely. The original deed to the Beaufort property, which had been removed from the filing cabinet at our home during what I now understood had been the Christmas visit. He had taken it. He had been holding it. And he had apparently believed, right up until the moment the storage unit was opened, that possessing it meant he still had leverage. The call I received from him came 24 hours after that discovery, which told me that someone in his orbit had tipped him off that the game was changing. He called from a number I didn't recognize, an attempt, I assumed, to get around the no-contact order he had already violated simply by making the call. I answered because I recognized the area code, and because some part of me, the part that will always be his mother no matter what, couldn't not answer. His voice was different this time. The performance was gone. What was left was something rawer, something I hadn't heard from him in years, genuine desperation, stripped of its charm and its calculation. He said he needed to talk to me. He said the lawyers were making everything worse. He said he just needed me to fix the deed situation and everything else could be worked out. I couldn't believe he was still reaching for leverage with one hand while the other was already caught in a closing trap. I let him talk. This is something I've learned about confrontation. The person who talks the most tells you the most, and I had more to gain from listening than from speaking. He laid out, in that phone call, a version of events in which he was the victim, of bad partners, bad timing, bad luck, and in which the scheme had never been designed to harm us, just to buy time while things stabilized. He said Carla had pushed for it. He said Gregory Polk had made promises he hadn't kept. He said the men in the trucks were not dangerous, that I had misread the situation, that if I had just come to the farmhouse like a normal person, none of this would have happened. That last sentence, none of this would have happened, and the breathtaking implication that my refusal to walk into a trap was the cause of all subsequent consequences, told me everything I needed to know about the distance still between Nathan and any genuine accountability. "Nathan," I said when he finally paused, "I'm not going to do anything with the deed." A silence. "And I'm not going to ask the investigators to go easy on you." Another silence. Longer this time, and in it I heard something I hadn't expected. Not rage, not a new argument, but a sound like a man running out of road. The reclaiming I had been doing since that farmhouse afternoon, of my narrative, my dignity, my understanding of my own family, had been quiet and consistent, and built on truth. And in this moment, it was completing itself, not with drama or vindication, but with a clear, calm sentence to my son. I will not protect you from this. Not because I stopped loving him, but because love without honesty is just a comfortable form of harm, and I had done enough of that already. He hung up. Within the hour, Detective Reeves called to tell me Nathan had been taken back into custody for violating the no-contact order, and that the additional evidence from the storage unit had significantly strengthened the case. I sat in my living room after that call, in the chair by the window where I had spent so many mornings reading, watching the light move across the floor in the long way it does in early summer. The justice I felt was not triumphant. It was quiet, and it was earned, and it was complicated by grief in every direction. But it was real, and real justice, the kind built from truth rather than reaction, doesn't roar. It settles. And something in me, for the first time in months, began to settle too. But the settling wasn't the end. The end, or rather, the beginning of whatever came after, required one final act that no court could order and no investigation could compel. The sentencing hearing was held on a gray October morning in Macon, in a courtroom that smelled like old paper and central air, and the specific kind of institutional quiet that descends on a room when the weight of what's about to happen becomes too large for ordinary noise. I sat in the second row with Mark on my left and Maya on my right, and I watched my son walk in wearing a suit I didn't recognize, with a lawyer I'd never met, looking like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Carla had accepted a plea deal 2 weeks before, cooperation in exchange for reduced charges, and she sat on the other side of the room, apart from Nathan, the geography of the courtroom mapping exactly the geography of what the last year had done to whatever they had once been to each other. Gregory Polk had already been sentenced separately. The men from the trucks had been identified and faced their own charges. The machine had moved, as machines do, deliberately, systematically, without the mercy that personal relationships sometimes afford, and without the cruelty that personal anger sometimes delivers. The prosecutor was thorough. She walked the court through the full timeline: the loans, the documents, the forged signatures, the surveillance of our home during Christmas, the farmhouse plan, the pursuit on the highway, the storage unit, the phone call that violated the no-contact order. Hearing it laid out in that sequence, clean, logical, beginning to end, was both devastating and necessary. It made the vengeance I had sometimes been tempted toward feel entirely beside the point. The facts were the punishment. The truth was the testimony. I didn't need to perform anger in a courtroom because the court was doing what courts are supposed to do, illuminating what actually happened without embellishment or mercy, and allowing the weight of it to sit where it belonged. Nathan received 32 months, with eligibility for early release after serving 2/3 of the sentence, plus mandatory financial restitution and 5 years of supervised probation following release. Carla received 18 months suspended with 3 years probation, contingent on full cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the private lending network. As the judge read the sentence, Nathan turned and looked at me, directly, for the first time since the farmhouse road, and I looked back. I didn't look away, and I didn't look angry. I just held his gaze, quietly, the way you look at something you understand fully and have decided to stop being destroyed by. He looked away first. I don't know what he saw in my face. I know what I felt. Not satisfaction, not relief, not victory. Something much harder to name. A kind of sorrow that has accepted itself. Marcus and Lily were with Maya during the hearing, at a park across town. We had decided together that a courtroom was not a place for children on this particular day, and that what they needed was a present adult rather than an absent one. The protection I offered Marcus and Lily in the months that followed was not about keeping them from the truth, but about giving them access to it at the right pace, in the right context, with enough support around them that it didn't flatten them. Self-worth, I've come to believe, is not built by protecting people from hard things. It's built by standing with them inside hard things, so they don't have to carry the weight alone. I intended to stand with those children for as long as they needed, regardless of what their father had done, because they were innocent, and innocence deserved to be preserved even when everything around it was complicated. The children were protected by the court. Nathan's parental rights were not terminated, but a formal custody arrangement was established that prioritized stability and professional support for both Marcus and Lily. Carla, whatever her failings, had been a consistent physical presence for her children, and the arrangement reflected that, carefully monitored. I'm not here to tell you that justice is perfect, or that courts are infallible, or that what was handed down in that Macon courtroom on a gray October morning repaired what had been broken. It didn't. Some things don't repair, they transform, and what they transform into depends entirely on what you choose to build in the space left by the wreckage. What I chose, what Mark and I chose, and Maya, and eventually Marcus and Lily in their own ways, was honesty. Radical, persistent, sometimes uncomfortable honesty. Reclaiming your life after a betrayal this size means refusing to let the lie continue in any form, including the comfortable form of pretending the damage wasn't as deep as it was. And the most powerful thing I did throughout this entire ordeal, more powerful than any confrontation, any testimony, any document, was simply to refuse to protect anyone's reputation at the expense of the truth. That refusal was my justice. That refusal was my payback. That refusal was, in the end, the most radical act of love I knew how to offer, to myself, to Mark, to my grandchildren, and even, in some complicated and unresolved way I'm still learning to hold, to the son who had made himself a stranger, and was now beginning, slowly, the long work of becoming someone worth knowing again. People ask me what revenge looks like when you're 63 years old, and it's your own son on the other side of it. And the honest answer is, it looks nothing like what you expect. It doesn't look like winning. It doesn't look like a confrontation where you finally say the words that cut deepest and watch the other person crumble. It doesn't look like fire. It looks like light. Steady, patient, unrelenting light shone into every corner that was designed to stay dark until there's nowhere left for the shadow to hide. That's what I chose instead of vengeance. Not because I was above the anger, but because I understood, somewhere along the way, that the anger was covering something more important. The absolute bedrock belief that the truth of my life mattered more than the lie someone else had tried to write over it. The Beaufort property was never transferred. The accounts were never accessed. The legal protections Detective Reeves helped us put in place during the investigation, updated estate documents, financial firewalls, clear legal designations, made our financial situation more secure than it had ever been. With the bitter irony that we had Nathan's scheme to thank for pushing us to finally address structures we had left informal for too long out of laziness and trust. The process of reclaiming what we had nearly lost forced us to understand it more precisely than we ever had before, and there was something unexpectedly empowering about that. Mark said it felt like finally reading the manual for something you'd been operating by instinct for 40 years. He was right. The dignity of understanding your own life fully, the paperwork and the limits and the rights and the safeguards, is something I recommend to every person, regardless of whether they've ever had reason to need it. I rebuilt my relationship with Maya with a patience and honesty I hadn't always brought to it before, because the events of that year had stripped away every comfortable deflection we'd both been relying on. We talked about Nathan in ways we'd never talked about him. Not defending, not prosecuting, just seeing him clearly for the first time, and seeing ourselves in relation to him clearly too. We talked about the role we'd each played in keeping the family mythology intact, long past the point where reality had stopped supporting it. Those conversations were not easy, and they were not comfortable, and they were the most genuinely intimate things we had shared in years. Family betrayal at that scale leaves a particular kind of wreckage, but it also removes every excuse not to be honest. And in that strange way, it handed me relationships more real than the ones I'd been carrying. Marcus came to visit every few weeks through the winter. He started talking more, slowly, in the careful way of someone learning that the words they say will be received and not weaponized. And I listened. He was still angry at his father in the unresolved way of 14-year-olds who haven't finished having the fathers they needed. He was also, in the contradictory way of the same age, still fiercely proud of what he remembered his father being before the fractures showed. I didn't try to smooth either of those truths into something easier for him to carry. I just kept showing up, with food, with presence, with complete consistency. Because dignity is taught by demonstration and not by lecture. And what I wanted Marcus to learn more than anything was that trustworthy people exist, that they don't flinch when things get hard, and that he was worth the showing up. The letter from Nathan arrived 8 months after sentencing. Handwritten, 3 pages, arrived on a Tuesday morning in a plain envelope with a return address I didn't recognize at first. I sat with it for 3 days before I opened it. Inside were the things you might expect: admission, apology, explanation, regret. And also some things I hadn't expected. A detailed account of how the shame of his failures had driven him further and further from honesty. Each lie building a wall between him and the people who might have helped him if he'd just told the truth. He wrote that watching me refuse to protect his deception, watching me choose truth over family loyalty in the way our culture often conflates them, had been the thing that finally made him understand the difference between love and enablement. I don't know what comes next with Nathan. I don't know whether the man who wrote that letter will be the man who walks out after 32 months, or whether the distance between a letter and a life is bridgeable from where he's standing. But I held those 3 pages and I felt, for the first time since that farmhouse road, something close to the beginning of a beginning. The karma of this entire story is not that Nathan suffered because he did wrong, though consequences are real, and they are right. The karma is that the same honesty he tried to exploit became the force that protected us, exposed him, and may, I say carefully, I make no promises, offer him a path toward something better than what he became. The truth was the most powerful thing in this entire story. Not the forgery, not the trucks, not the courtroom. The truth. And the moment I stopped standing in its way and let it move, through the investigation, through the testimony, through the difficult conversations, through the letter, through the slow and still unfinished work of rebuilding, that was the moment I understood what real justice actually is. That moment on the road when I told Mark to turn the car around, that was the moment everything changed. And it's not something done to someone. It's something you build with your own hands, from the honest materials available, with every person still willing to stand in the light with you. If you've made it this far with me, through the farmhouse road and the gas station and the courtroom and the letters and the long, unfinished work of rebuilding, then you already know that this story doesn't end with a bow on it. Real life doesn't. Real justice doesn't. What it ends with is something quieter and more durable. The understanding that the most powerful thing you can do in the aftermath of a betrayal isn't to perform your anger or demand a perfect outcome. It's to stay in the truth. Stubbornly, consistently, even when it costs you. Especially when it costs you. Now I want to hear from you. Because I know this isn't just my story. I know that somewhere in what I've shared today, something landed. A detail, a moment, a feeling you recognized from your own life or the life of someone you love. Maybe you've been where I was, watching signs you couldn't quite name, protecting a silence you weren't sure was serving anyone, loving someone whose choices were slowly becoming a danger to everything you'd built. Or maybe you've been on the other side of a story like this, carrying something you haven't told yet. Drop a comment below and tell me. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting yourself from what that love was costing you? What did you do? What do you wish you had done? And if you've ever experienced a betrayal inside your own family, the kind that rewrites everything, how did you begin to rebuild? I'm not asking for the polished version. I'm asking for the true one. The truth, as I hope this story showed, is the only thing that actually holds. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see something in your own life from a different angle, share it. Send it to the person in your life who needs to hear it, or the one you've been afraid to have the conversation with. And if you want more of this, more stories where the complexity is honored, where the pain is real, where the people are full human beings making terrible and sometimes redemptive choices, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon. Because we don't do surface level here. We go where the truth actually lives, and there's so much more of it still to tell.